The 6 dangerous personality types Carl Jung says you must avoid. Do you believe you possess a clear understanding of those in your life? Can you readily spot toxicity, sense a burdensome atmosphere, or identify behavior that oversteps acceptable boundaries? What if the most significant hazards aren't immediately apparent? What if the individuals capable of the deepest destruction are often outwardly charming, benevolent, or even members of your own family? While your defenses are aimed at overt antagonists, you might unknowingly be vulnerable to a far more insidious invasion, the unconscious of another subtly encroaching upon your own. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, dedicated his life's work to illuminating these concealed psychological dynamics. In seminal texts such as The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung posited that a vast portion of what truly governs our thoughts, feelings, and actions lies beyond the reach of our conscious awareness. This principle applies universally to you and to everyone you encounter. And it is precisely within this shared unconscious realm that a profound danger resides. When individuals remain blind to their own inner darkness, that unacknowledged shadow seeks an external vessel, a host. Frequently, you become that host. Pause for a moment and consider this. How many times have you felt utterly depleted after an interaction? How often have you been unjustly blamed for circumstances outside your control? Or found yourself thrust into the role of rescuer for a drama that wasn't yours to begin? Jung termed this phenomenon projection, an unconscious defense mechanism through which an individual attributes aspects of their own unacknowledged self onto another. In this process, you cease to be seen as a distinct person and are instead transformed into a symbol, a mirror reflecting their hidden noitum, an imaginary adversary, or an idealized figure of salvation. The common thread? None of these symbolic roles represents your authentic self. The truly unsettling aspect is the frequent lack of awareness that you are even participating in this unconscious drama. You may genuinely believe you are offering support, practicing empathy, or exhibiting maturity. All the while, you are being drawn into a psychological landscape that is not your own, attempting to resolve conflicts that are not yours to untangle, and being swayed by dynamics you did not initiate, but which now exert control over you. Jung emphasized that the most significant psychological threats do not typically stem from consciously malicious individuals. Instead, they arise from those whose unconscious remains fragmented and unintegrated. These are individuals estranged from their own inner world, dominated by the masks they wear, unresolved traumas, powerful complexes, and suppressed desires. They are not inherently evil. They are, however, profoundly dangerous. This danger operates subtly, not forcing its way in, but infiltrating gradually, day by day, through seemingly minor exchanges, veiled critiques, unspoken accusations, loaded silences. This slow erosion can lead you to question your own perceptions and sanity. As you lose touch with your own inner reality, you risk becoming absorbed into their projected shadow. Perhaps this resonates with your current experience, within a relationship, a friendship, a professional setting, or even your family circle. You might be internalizing blame, desperately seeking to understand what is wrong with you. The crucial realization is this: there is likely nothing inherently wrong with you. The issue lies instead in the way you are being unconsciously utilized as a receptacle for another's unexamined psychological content. Drawing directly from Jung's extensive body of work, including Ion, the Ego and the Unconscious, Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, and Psychological Types, we will now explore 6 distinct psychological profiles that Jungian thought would identify as emotionally perilous. These are not individuals acting out of deliberate ill will, but rather those driven by powerful internal forces they themselves do not comprehend, making their impact all the more destructive. We will illuminate how to recognize these patterns. Moreover, this exploration offers a challenging possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, elements of one or more of these profiles reside within you as well. Are you prepared to look? Take a deep breath and let us proceed. Be forewarned, after examining these dynamics, you may find yourself unable to view others or even yourself in quite the same light again. The unconscious puppeteer, pulled into their unseen conflicts. Imagine a dynamic where another person holds you accountable for their every emotional state, where your mere presence becomes a trigger and you are made to feel responsible for feelings you did not induce. Initially, they might appear vulnerable, highly sensitive, or exceptionally profound. Yet, over time, you awaken to the unsettling reality that you are being drawn into a psychological battleground that is not yours, already positioned at a distinct disadvantage. This is the hallmark of the unconscious manipulator, an individual who, unaware of their own unhealed wounds, projects them onto others as an unconscious strategy for psychic survival. Jung profoundly observed, "What we do not confront in ourselves, we will meet as fate." Frequently, this fate manifests with a name, a face, and a shared space in your life. The unconscious manipulator is often under the sway of repressed psychological material, unintegrated traumas, fragmented emotional experiences that have not been processed. Rather than turning their gaze inward, they direct their inner turmoil toward you, transforming you into a screen onto which their internal conflicts are projected. This type of person exists in a state of chronic projection. While Jung considered projection an inherent function of the psyche, he also stressed that if it remains unconscious, it becomes profoundly destructive. In The Ego and the Unconscious, he noted that projection causes a kind of psychic blindness, a prison where the other ceases to be seen as they are and becomes used as a symbol of what is hidden in us. This precisely describes the unconscious manipulator's dynamic. They do not perceive you. They see a disowned part of themselves reflected in you and react to that reflection as if it were your objective reality. These individuals often adopt a victim stance. Everything that goes wrong is attributed to external factors, never their own agency. Their anger is a result of your provocation. Their sadness stems from your perceived shortcomings. Their feelings of inferiority are blamed on your supposed arrogance. This distortion is frequently so subtle that it leads you to self-doubt. Was I insensitive? Did I say something hurtful? Am I in fact the problem? This is the mechanism of manipulation operating silently without overt demands or raised voices. It is an emotional, unconscious, and remarkably effective form of control. Adding to the complexity, these individuals can be incredibly charming, possessing charisma, a captivating sensitivity, and an aura of emotional intensity. This creates a powerful lure, as you may feel compelled to help them, to heal their perceived pain, or to understand them in a way others seemingly cannot. However, in attempting to save someone who is unwilling to confront their own inner world, you are, in essence, sacrificing your own psychological well-being. The more you try to pull them out, the deeper you sink into their projected reality. Jung's warning regarding these projection patterns is critical. They trap us in symbolic roles: savior, antagonist, betrayer, parental figure, anything but our authentic selves. To exist within such a symbolic bond is to inhabit an illusion. You are no longer treated as a distinct individual, but as a distorted reflection of the other's unconscious landscape. The path to safeguarding yourself from an unconscious manipulator lies in cultivating awareness, recognizing these recurring patterns, and consciously severing the invisible ties that bind you to their emotional narrative. Crucially, you must consistently discern whether the emotions you are experiencing are genuinely yours or have been induced by the other's projections. The unconscious manipulator does not breach your boundaries violently. They enter through the unguarded portal of your empathy. Once you begin to recognize this pattern, the next step is to understand how it can be even more deeply masked by the persona, the psychological facade adopted by those who live primarily to project an image of what they are not, often at the expense of their true selves. The architect of appearance trapped behind the flawless facade. Psychological danger isn't always born of overt dysfunction. Sometimes it emanates from an appearance of excessive perfection, the perpetual smile, the impeccable demeanor, the flawless presentation. We inhabit a culture often preoccupied with seeming rather than being. For Jung, this was a significant concern, as an over-identification with the persona, the social mask we utilize to navigate the world, can lead to a profound disconnection from one's authentic core. Those who live solely for the sake of this mask not only lose themselves, but also begin to distort the reality of those around them. In The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung defined the persona as what one is in reality not, but what oneself as well as others think one is. It is, in essence, a constructed identity shaped by societal, familial, and professional expectations. The persona itself is not inherently problematic. It is a necessary tool for social adaptation, allowing us to fulfill various roles as professionals, family members, and friends. The danger arises when this mask becomes rigidly fused with the individual's sense of self, when the spontaneous, vulnerable, and authentic aspects of the personality are locked away in the psyche's hidden chambers. The bearer of the persona is a master of superficial functionality. They consistently say what is expected, behave in socially approved ways, and strenuously avoid conflict. However, behind this carefully constructed facade lies a soul potentially in disarray. The more energy invested in maintaining the image, the more the true self is stifled. This repression, inevitably, extracts a psychological toll. For those in close proximity to such an individual, the impact can be subtle yet significant. You may sense an underlying inauthenticity, a lack of genuine spontaneity or depth in interactions. Everything might feel rehearsed or artificial. Furthermore, the bearer of the persona often projects their own demand for perfection onto others. They expect you to conform, to perform according to the unwritten script, to collaborate in maintaining the illusion. Should you express something that deviates from this script, an intense emotion, a genuine doubt, a vulnerability, they may withdraw, become visibly uncomfortable, or shut down emotionally. Anything that mirrors their own repressed noitum becomes intolerable to them. Jung viewed this over-identification with the persona as a significant impediment to the process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward psychological wholeness and the integration of the conscious and unconscious. The real risk, he argued, emerges when an individual becomes hypnotized by the role they play, mistakenly believing that the mask is their true identity. Living solely for external validation and acceptance makes one a prisoner of their own facade, suffocating the genuine self beneath the veneer of acceptability. Coexisting with a bearer of the persona is more than just artificial. It can be psychologically contagious. You might find yourself beginning to self-monitor, carefully choosing your words and concealing aspects of yourself that don't align with their idealized narrative. Gradually, you too may unconsciously adopt a mask. However, there is a darker dimension to this dynamic. When feelings, thoughts, and desires are repressed for extended periods, they do not simply vanish. They accumulate, festering in the unconscious until they coalesce into the shadow. This leads us into an even more volatile territory, the realm of denied emotions that return with potentially explosive force. The custodian of the unseen when denied darkness explodes. Consider individuals who appear perpetually controlled, meticulously polished, and outwardly restrained. They are consistently proper, moderate, and polite. Yet, beneath this surface of composure lies a potent force on the verge of eruption. This is because everything they deem wrong, unacceptable, or dark within themselves is not genuinely processed or transformed, but merely pushed down into the basement of the psyche. This is the essence of the owner of the repressed shadow, someone striving for constant lightness until their unacknowledged darkness seizes control. Carl Jung dedicated considerable effort to understanding the shadow. In Ion, he describes it as everything that the individual refuses to recognize in themselves and yet insists on manifesting in some way. The shadow is not an external entity. It is not the embodiment of worldly evil or an external adversary. The shadow is an internal reality. The unacknowledged resentment you harbor, the envy you rationalize away, the sexuality you suppress, the ambition you disguise as humility. Everything you reject within yourself persists, transforming into shadow material. As Jung famously stated, what you do not make conscious directs your life, and you call it destiny. At first glance, the owner of the repressed shadow may not appear dangerous. On the contrary, they might be admired for their discipline, perceived kindness, or helpfulness. Yet there is an underlying tension, a subtle dissonance. They often exhibit intolerance for perceived weakness in others, react negatively to spontaneity, and are visibly uncomfortable with intense emotions. They seem perpetually charged, yet rarely express it directly until the pressure becomes unbearable and they inevitably explode. When this occurs, the impact can be devastating. This individual lives in a state of constant emotional vigilance, denying themselves the full spectrum of human feeling. Consequently, they often condemn those who allow themselves emotional expression. They are unforgiving of errors in others because they cannot tolerate their own imperfections. They may become rigidly moralistic, excessively demanding, or overly controlling, all in an unconscious effort to maintain a precarious hold on their repressed content. Jung was explicit. The stronger the persona, the more repressed the shadow. And conversely, the more intensely the shadow is repressed, the more brutal and unpredictable its eventual manifestation. You can often identify this pattern in individuals who react disproportionately to minor events, who nurse grudges for years, or who engage in passive-aggressive sabotage of relationships. They are the archetypal difficult people, whose underlying bitterness, resentment, and critical nature seem inexplicable to those around them. The root lies in the unintegrated, unacknowledged, and unaccepted shadow. It is crucial to understand that the shadow is not composed solely of negative aspects. As Jung clarified, it also contains denied potential, stifled creativity, and unexpressed strength. However, when the shadow is ignored and repressed, these latent capacities can become distorted, turning into a psychological poison. This poison then contaminates relationships, environments, and particularly those in close proximity. Living with the owner of the repressed shadow is akin to navigating an emotional minefield. You are never certain where a misstep will lead to an explosion. This deep-seated repression is often fueled by an unconscious sense of superiority, a rigid adherence to moral ideals that transform guilt into a tool of control. This leads us to the next profile, the moral controller, the self-appointed arbiter using virtue as a weapon. Not all psychological executioners wield obvious instruments of power. Some employ crosses, rigid rules, inflexible dogmas, and prepackaged pronouncements. These are individuals who position themselves as paragons of ethics, righteousness, and morality. Yet, beneath the surface, they are often trapping themselves and others within a psychological cage constructed of guilt and shame. Jung recognized this archetype. He understood that when morality is wielded as a facade rather than lived authentically, it can become one of the most insidious forms of psychic repression. This is the dynamic of the moral controller. Rather than engaging in the challenging work of integrating their own shadow, they project its unwanted aspects onto the behavior of others, condemning them for the very impulses or desires they deny within themselves. You have undoubtedly encountered such individuals. They are quick to point fingers, but rarely turn their gaze inward. They present themselves as behavioral benchmarks, not out of genuine virtue, but from a desperate need to maintain an outward appearance of moral superiority. According to Jung, the more intense the internal repression, the greater the compulsion to project the shadow onto others. The moral controller exemplifies this, transforming others into perceived sinners, deviants, or the morally flawed to avoid confronting their own desires, impulses, and inherent human contradictions. The critical difference between the moral controller and a more overt manipulator is that the moral controller often genuinely believes they are acting for the greater good. They sincerely feel they are correcting, guiding, or morally educating others. This conviction makes their influence particularly toxic, as it is cloaked in an aura of authority, good intentions, and sometimes a false sense of spirituality. Their criticisms are often delivered with phrases like, "It's for your own benefit," "You'll appreciate this later," or "Someone needs to tell you the truth." However, this truth is far from neutral. It is heavily laden with their own unacknowledged projections. In Ion, Jung explored the archetypes of Christ and the Antichrist as symbolic representations of wholeness and dissociation. The moral controller identifies with the light, believing themselves to embody virtue while completely disowning their own inherent darkness. They project evil onto others to maintain the illusion of their own purity. This renders them psychologically blind, incapable of perceiving the complex nuances of the human soul, and thus dangerous. If you are in close proximity to a moral controller, you may find yourself wrestling with pervasive feelings of guilt, as if you are perpetually falling short, even when simply living authentically. You may feel constantly observed, judged, and diminished. The most insidious aspect is the potential for internalizing this external judgment, leading you to repress natural, human, and spontaneous aspects of yourself in an attempt to conform to an ideal that is not your own. The other's rigid morality becomes your psychological prison. This dynamic is frequently observed in families, certain religious environments, and any rigid system where unquestioning obedience is conflated with virtue. Jung recognized this pattern as a significant barrier to individuation. Where excessive moralism prevails, genuine self-knowledge is often absent. The extreme moralist is not seeking truth, they are seeking control. And when they cannot control the external world to their satisfaction, they may attempt to control the internal world of those within their sphere of influence. However, the moral controller is not the only type driven by powerful unconscious forces. There is another profile that is even more volatile, unstable, and unpredictable: the complexed individual. The unpredictable echo when traumas take the reins. While the moralist rigidly represses and projects, the complexed individual is often overwhelmed by autonomous unconscious contents, reacting to present circumstances as if they were an emotional puppet on strings controlled by unseen forces. Imagine being in a relationship with someone who in one moment is warm, affectionate, and generous, only to erupt in sudden anger in the next, retreat into stony silence, or accuse you of something entirely unfounded. A simple compliment is twisted into a demand. A light-hearted joke is perceived as aggression. A gesture of affection is interpreted as a threat. Regardless of your actions, you feel as though you are constantly navigating unstable terrain. This is the lived experience of those connected to someone dominated by unconscious complexes. For Jung, complexes are autonomous, emotionally charged clusters of ideas and memories residing in the unconscious, capable of seizing control of consciousness at any given moment. They are like fragmented sub-personalities born from psychological wounds, unresolved conflicts, and undigested past experiences. In Psychological Types and the Ego and the Unconscious, Jung detailed how these complexes can directly dictate an individual's behavior, causing them to react not to the reality of the present, but to the lingering echoes of the past. A seemingly innocuous comment can unconsciously trigger an old wound of abandonment, rejection, or humiliation, and those nearby bear the brunt of the ensuing emotional storm. The complexed individual is often unaware that they are being driven by these internal forces. When they react with intense fury, profound sadness, or exaggerated resentment, they genuinely believe their reaction is justified and rational, failing to recognize that they are reliving unintegrated emotional experiences. The complicating factor is that this behavior is rarely consistent. Emotional outbursts are interspersed with moments of clarity, genuine affection, or sincere regret. This oscillation makes the relationship deeply confusing and, paradoxically, often addictive. You might cling to the hope offered by the good moments, thinking, they aren't always like this. Sometimes they are wonderful. This hope can keep you ensnared. In an attempt to restore harmony and avoid triggering the volatile complex, you may find yourself adapting your behavior, shrinking your authentic self, and carefully measuring your words. You might feel compelled to walk on eggshells, desperately trying to avoid awakening the perceived monster within the other person. But here lies the difficult truth. That inner turmoil is not awakened by you. It is a constant, latent presence, waiting for any stimulus to emerge and dominate. When it does, it can consume everything in its path. Jung believed that unacknowledged complexes can effectively colonize the psyche, speaking, feeling, and acting on behalf of the individual. In the complexed person, this takeover happens frequently and unpredictably. They may be dominated by a complex of inferiority, a martyr complex, a fear of abandonment, or a persecution complex, each bringing its own distorted narratives, intense emotions, and unconscious demands. The more you try to placate or control the situation, the more you feed the illusion that controlling the uncontrollable is possible. Being close to someone dominated by complexes means living in a state of perpetual alert. Emotional stability is elusive. The present moment is constantly contaminated by the ghosts of their past. And insidiously, you may begin to absorb these ghosts, doubting your own perceptions, your memory, and the validity of your feelings. Without realizing it, you too can become psychologically colonized by the other's unconscious material. However, the complex individual's dramatic oscillations are not the only form of subtle psychological drain. There is another type that may not exhibit explosive behavior, but can quietly consume your vital energy until you are left feeling completely depleted. The unseen drain when connection becomes consumption. Some individuals don't seek your genuine presence, they crave your energy. And they will, often unconsciously, employ various means to deplete it, not through overt aggression, but through subtle yet persistent demands, chronic victimhood, or emotional dependency disguised as affection. This is the dynamic of the psychic vampire, perhaps the most silent and insidious form of emotional draining, even if Jung did not use this specific term. In Jungian language, this pattern often reflects an unresolved symbiotic relationship, a pathological bond that hinders psychological growth and blurs the boundaries of the self. Across his works, including The Ego and the Unconscious and Ion, Jung highlighted symbiotic relationships as significant impediments to the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, integrated individual. In such bonds, the individuals do not recognize each other as separate entities, but function as psychological extensions of one another. The psychic vampire thrives in this type of connection. They require your constant attention, daily reassurance, and unwavering availability. Yet beneath this apparent neediness lies a profound inner void that is not yours to fill, and which, despite your efforts, you never can. The dynamic often begins subtly. You offer support, then gradually give more and more of your time. You might tolerate emotional manipulation or passive-aggressive behavior in the name of understanding or compassion. Slowly, you realize that your energy reserves are being completely drained, and the boundaries between where you end and the other person begins have become dangerously blurred. The resulting exhaustion is not merely physical. It is a deep existential depletion, as if your very soul is being consumed, drop by drop, day after day. Jung spoke of individuals who, lacking the internal resources to sustain themselves psychologically, attach to others like emotional parasites. While this may sound harsh, it describes the functional reality of this dynamic. The psychic vampire is not seeking to grow or become more self-sufficient. They are unconsciously seeking to be carried by the energy of another. The danger extends beyond mere exhaustion. It lies in the potential dissolution of your own sense of self. You may begin to feel guilty for needing personal space, selfish for seeking solitude, or cold for establishing healthy boundaries. The psychic vampire is often adept at unconsciously reversing the roles, shifting from the position of the needy victim to that of the accuser or manipulator when their demands are not met. Before you fully grasp what is happening, you may find yourself living primarily to avoid upsetting them, to maintain a fragile peace, and to sustain a bond that is slowly eroding your inner vitality. Jung's work consistently offers a path toward navigating these challenging dynamics, the crucial process of making the unconscious conscious. This applies not only to understanding the unconscious patterns of others, but, perhaps more importantly, to recognizing these patterns within ourselves. As Jung understood, none of us are entirely immune to these dynamics. We all carry a shadow. We all experience pain and unresolved aspects of our psyche. The fundamental difference lies in who possesses the courage to look inward and who unconsciously chooses to project that unexamined weight onto others. This exploration has served as a mirror, a descent into the often hidden psychological dynamics that can bind us, wound us, and keep us in a state of unconscious reaction. If you have journeyed this far, it suggests a readiness to see, to name, and to potentially break free from these patterns.